Hello friends, today's lecture is on symbolic expression, and in the studio we have Manisha Sharma as an expert, sign language expert with us, and the topic of today's lecture is cinema and the leaders of Indian national movement. We'll talk about the various leaders during the freedom struggle who in a way contributed to the growth of cinema, or the kind of interventions which they made led to the growth of cinema. Cinema, as we are aware, grew during the times of the national movement, and it was an important part during that time in terms of cultural intervention in the national movement as well. So we find that some of the leaders of the national movement, how beginning from Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who definitely played an important role in that sense, that he promoted the films of Dada Sahab Phalke during that time in his newspaper Swadeshi. So the films which were made during that time, which were the Swadeshi films, and Bal Gangadhar Tilak supported them in his newspaper. Apart from that, we also see that Lala Lajpat Rai, he also made an important contribution when he talked about the issues of censorship in the Legislative Assembly. We also find N. Satyamurthy, who was one of the important leaders, also played an important role in terms of propaganda films which he made for the elections. Then we also find that Gandhi had some kind of aversion to cinema or films, and Gandhi was not very fond of them, and in his lifetime he only saw one film, and even for any kind of encouragement to the films he was not ready. So the filmmakers, they wanted him to in a way contribute in that sense, that Gandhi in a way should try to motivate the film industry or the filmmakers, those who were part of the film industry, but that did not happen. And it is also ironical that Gandhi was represented in cinema many a times, not only in the mainstream films, but a number of documentaries, topicals, they were being made on Gandhi. And so we find that a number of leaders, how they contributed to that particular atmosphere of the freedom struggle. And in that series you can refer to some of the references: Gautam Kaul Cinema and the Indian Freedom Struggle, collected works of Lala Lajpat Rai, S.T. Bhaskaran, Message Bearers, Nationalist Politics and Entertainment, Media in South India. Then Home Political Files, both of them they have been mentioned concerning the censorship, and Firoz Rangoonwala's 75 Years of Indian Cinema. So these are some of the readings which one can refer when one is talking about cinema and the Indian freedom struggle. And we also see that how during this particular period, how the colonial censors, they excised or they cut scenes or they banned some of the dialogues which were there in many of the films. And we also find that India's struggle for independence was also the result of the exploitative and the discriminatory colonial policies in every sphere, and how the ordinary masses, they participated in the movement, and many of them, we find that they were impressed by the leaders, and we also find that many of the leaders, they raised concerns regarding the field of cinema and the censorship as well. And in this way their interventions were very helpful in terms of placing issues at the official levels and also raising the consciousness of the masses as well. And we find that these interventions which were made by the various leaders, they were associated with the national movement in the field of cinema and censorship. And how these leaders, they were also in a way aware about the potentiality of cinema as an instrument of propaganda. And British, they also realized this, and they wanted to tame such kind of projections on the celluloid by in a way using the censorship authority by them. So we find that, as I told you, leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Sardar Patel, then Lala Lajpat Rai, Satyamurthy, Mahatma Gandhi, all of them, they had some kind of interventions with regard to cinema or their ideas. And then we also see some of the lady leaders like Rameshwari Nehru or Sarojini Naidu, both of them, those who had their own ideas with regard to films. And we find that Bal Gangadhar Tilak was the first national leader who exhibited his interest in cinema, and he in a way supported the development of the indigenous film industry. and in his newspaper Kesari he praised Raja Harishchandra as the first Swadeshi film. So we find that Raja Harishchandra, which was made in 1913 and which was considered to be the first feature film of India, and how Dada Saheb Phalke was associated with the filmmaking. And Tilak praised this particular film in the Marathi press, in which the film reviews they were being carried, and he even proposed to open a film company with Dada Saheb Phalke as well. And we also see that how his newspaper Kesari supported Phalke in his later ventures as well, and constantly published the reviews of his films. So we find that until his death in 1920, Tilak acted as a well-wisher of the Indian cinema and the pioneers, those who were associated with these films. Then we also see that how Rabindranath Tagore, he also exhibited an interest in cinema, and some of his short stories, they were filmed, namely Manabhanjan in 1923, Balidan in 27, Bicharik in 1929, Dalia in 1930, Giribala in 1930, and Naukadubi in 1932. So we find that Tagore's contribution in that sense was in the framework of a lot of writing, that how his short stories they were being adapted on the screen, and the names which I have mentioned, many of them they were being filmed by the filmmakers. And we also see that he also attempted to direct Natir Puja, a film in 1932, and also acted as an old monk in this film. So we find that how Tagore had recorded his voice on a gramophone disc, a rendering of Vande Mataram, as early as 1900s. And we find that in 1922, when the colonial rule was being imposing censorship in the media in general, and Lala Lajpat Rai, he supported the cinema as a tool of free expression and sought its exclusion from the purview of censors. So how the various leaders, they were very well aware about the designs of the British, that how the use of the censorship machinery by the British, where we find that a number of films which were catering to the sex and violence, they were being allowed by the colonial censors, and anything which was inimical to the interests of the Raj in the framework of any revolutionary theme, or for that matter any theme which was concerning the national movement, any ideas of democracy with regard to the films which were coming from America, all of them, they were being banned or excised, and their dialogues, they were being deleted. Many a time scenes, they were being deleted from these films. So the concern of the censorship authority was arbitrary in that sense, and we find that how Lala Lajpat Rai's interest in cinema as a means of disseminating information, including the political information, for which he had given his critical observations as well. And 1922, Lala Lajpat Rai argued that it is our belief that freedom of speech and writing is birthright of ourselves. And he also said that there can only be one restriction to it, and it is this, that by freedom one may not intrude upon natural rights of others, and one may not do anything against ethics. So we find that how the national leaders, they were full of ethics, their ideas were such, and they also realized that freedom did not mean absolute freedom, and the natural rights of others, they should not be intruded upon, and anything which is against ethics, that should also be in a way not followed, should not be followed. So we find that the contribution of these leaders in this particular sense, especially the censorship of the cinematograph films, Lajpat Rai argued in the Central Legislative Assembly on 14 September 1927 that it is my duty to enter an emphatic protest against the insidious way in which various methods are adopted to thrust principle of British imperial preferences. I think this is a very objectionable procedure, and I find that the real object of this resolution is practically to afford a kind of protection to films produced in British Empire. So we find that how he was very well aware that how Britishers, they wanted to protect the films which were made in Britain, in India, They did not want that films from Hollywood, from America, they should come and they should flood the markets, because cinema, as not only in the sense of cultural tool, not only in the sense of communicating the ideas, but also in the framework of we find that how it was able to garner a lot of revenue as well. So we find that how British, they were trying to control this kind of a situation, that how the British films, they can be given some kind of a preferential treatment, and this kind of a preferential treatment will lead to their popularity as well. And Lajpat Rai also in a way found that any kind of encouragement to the Indian industry was an eyewash, and he urged that no films except those produced in India should be exhibited in India at all. So he also was in a way emphasizing on the aspect of Swadeshi, that how the Swadeshi films, they should be in a way encouraged in India, and the other films which were not from India, they should be discouraged. And these kinds of concerns, they were also being raised in different forums. We find that some of the magazines like Film India and Abhyuday, etc., they clamored for such kind of portrayals in the British or the Hollywood films, where we find that scenes of sex and violence, they were being allowed, and they raised concerns with regard to the ethics in the society, or with regard to how the children, they can go astray by in a way watching these kinds of pictures which were being made. And it was the rationale was also being questioned by Lajpat Rai behind the imperial preferences, when he says that I do not see any reason why the British Empire should have preference, and why only films produced in the British Empire should be exhibited in India at all. I can see no basis for this resolution except anxiety of the government to protect and encourage British produced films. So he was very well aware that how British, they were trying to in a way present only those films which were made in Britain, and they wanted to in a way reject, or in a way not allow the European films, other European films, as well as the films which are made in America. And we find that these kinds of debates, they were happening in the Legislative Assembly, and such kind of concerns, they were being raised by Lala Lajpat Rai in the Legislative Assembly debates. And we also see that he pointed out that the European community was very anxious regarding films which are coming to India, which portrayed a degraded view of the European life. And he asked that, but are those films entirely false? And if they are true to life of people, why should there be any objection raised to their being exhibited in this country? So the films which were being shown in India, many of the European community members, they raised concerns regarding the portrayal of the Europeans in those films. And Lajpat Rai had this kind of a view that if any kind of degraded view of the European life was being shown in these films, so he was asking such kind of questions, that why such kind of questions they are being asked, because these things are not entirely false. And if these things are there in their life, then there should not be any kind of objection by others. And we also see that the kind of designs of British which were there in the context of India, where Lajpat Rai felt that I think there is a deliberate conspiracy amongst the film producers in various countries in Europe and America to bring into discredit and contempt all Asiatic countries by means of cinematographic productions. So he is raising some kind of questions that how the films which are made in Europe, or for that matter in America, how they are trying to show an Oriental life, and in these in the Oriental life they are trying to discredit the people, those who are living in Asia. So he has talked about that such kind of portrayals, they are detrimental in that sense, that they are not trying to give any kind of a correct picture, because apart from the kind of portrayals which are being shown in the European and the American films, we find that there is a lot of life which is different from what is being shown. And he also talks about the various films in England and elsewhere where a lot of disgraceful and the humiliating scenes they were being shown regarding the Asiatic life, and where we feel that the nauseous details of a Raja's life or a Nawab's harem, they are also being shown. and they were also reflective of the prejudice of the British and the other people against the Asiatics in general and Indians in particular. So we find that how perhaps the British films in competition with American films, they do not draw much crowded houses and do not bring in much money. So that is why such kind of projections they were being made, and Lajpat Rai in a way objected to such kind of projections which were made with regard to the Indian films. And he also talked about that he in a way objected to the whole of this kind of a resolution unless the words relating to the British Empire or the British Empire imperial preferences, they are entirely deleted. And he also talks about a defect in the amendment, which he pointed out that Honorable Mover had not added words manufactured in India. So his amendment therefore gives no encouragement to film industry in India. So Lala Lajpat Rai and others, they were very well aware that how Indian film industry was not given any kind of support or encouragement by the British, and Indian film industry was not the only industry which was not given encouragement. We also find that it was true with regard to any kind of industry in India, that British, they were not in a way interested to support the Indian industry. And we also see that how Lajpat Rai talks about the Home Member who communicated regarding some conference in England which discussed this subject and where India was properly represented as well. And this is the way in which India is being mistakenly forced to give consent to the proposals which are supposed to be for the good of the empire, but which are very detrimental to India. And this is what Lajpat Rai talks about, that how habitually the government catches hold of one or two gentlemen to represent the non-official India in various conferences. And in these conferences, whether sometimes it is a Hindu or a Muslim, and the character is always the same, because the non-official support which the government is seeking is being given by that member. And we also find that how Indian Cinematograph Committee report as an interesting document was seen by Lajpat Rai, and he expressed delight that the committee had unanimously rejected proposal to give preference to the empire produced film. And as we are aware as well, the Indian Cinematograph Committee (ICC) was in a way established or created in 1927-28, and it remarked that with reference to the exhibition of the British films under the imperial preferences, where T. Rangacharya, who was the chairman of this particular committee, and when this particular committee was appointed, we find that Lala Lajpat Rai had certain kind of reservation with regard to the chairman of the committee. But later, when the committee submitted its report and Lala Lajpat Rai became satisfied with that report, he commented later in the assembly that how he was wrong in terms of having those kind of reservation regarding Rangacharya, and he in a way felt sorry or remorse for the kind of reservation which he had. So that kind of large-heartedness in terms of agreeing, in terms of accepting, in terms of the kind of mistake one has committed could be seen in the leaders of those times. And we also see that Lala Lajpat Rai also talks about that if there is a misunderstanding of American scenes which are shown in the films and the confusion of them with the European civilization, especially the British civilization, it is because they regard all of them as one. If too much exhibition of the American films in countries is a danger to the national interest, too much exhibition of other Western films is as much a danger. So this was in a way communicated, this idea was communicated in the Indian Cinematograph Committee report by the chairman T. Rangacharya. So these were also the kind of ideas of Lala Lajpat Rai which he communicated in the Legislative Assembly. And when he saw that these kinds of ideas they were being communicated in the ICC or the Cinematograph Committee report, then he was satisfied with them. And he also talked about in the debates that how when the chairman was being appointed, he made some kind of comments about the proposed chairman which were not considered courteous. And Lala Lajpat Rai also expressed his view that from the Indian point of view it was not a bad report, and Lala Lajpat Rai was humble enough to acknowledge that his misgivings turned out to be unjustified with regard to T. Rangacharya's appointment, and he was glad for being mistaken and consequently unwaveringly withdrew what he said about Mr. Tirangachari earlier. So we find that when these kinds of things they were being discussed in the Legislative Assembly, when these kinds of ideas they were being talked about, they were also being reported in the newspapers as well. And when these things they were being reported in the newspapers, then other people they also came to know about what all was happening in the context of the Indian films, because the issue of censorship was very, very important in the framework of the British Times, where we find that the censorship was politically inspired, arbitrary in nature, and whenever they got a chance where anything which was related to the national movement that was being rejected by the censors. So we see that the issue of censorship was in a way important in those times, and how the other leaders of that particular period, how they were trying to in a way see films. And in that context, Jawaharlal Nehru, we find that he was not very expressive in his support for the Indian films, though he was quite aware of the trends and developments in India. And though he saw some of the films, Achut Kanya was being one in 1936, and he wrote a fan mail letter to Devika Rani, who was the heroine of the film, asking for an interview to discuss about that film, but the letter was not answered by Devika Rani. And Ashok Kumar made this kind of a reference with regard to the kind of letter of Nehru which was received by Devika Rani. And we find that Nehru also did send his good wishes to the Indian Motion Pictures Congress, which was held in Bombay in 1939, though he was not an enthusiastic supporter of the film medium. So we talked about some of the important leaders of the national movement, especially Bal Gangadhar Tilak. We also talked about Lala Lajpat Rai and how their contribution in the context of the questions which were raised in the assembly with regard to the censorship issues. We'll talk further about some other leaders with regard to the national movement and how the cinema was an important factor in that particular period in our next lecture. Thank you very much.